So we've learned a lot of the basics of argumentation at this point. We know the basic claim, warrant, impact structure. We know how to refute an argument. We know the difference between offense and defensive arguments. We know how to introduce evidence and read evidence as a way to support our warrants. Now imagine putting this all together and being in a debate round itself. And let's say your opponent starts introducing perhaps 5 arguments on a certain resolution, and you stand up and you try refuting each of those arguments while introducing some arguments of your own. If you go back and forth like this a couple of times, you can imagine it will be incredibly difficult for you to keep track of everything that's going on unless you have some way of keeping notes on everything that's going on in the debate round in a very organized fashion. That is what flowing is. And there's this very specific art to taking notes in a debate round to make sure that you keep your arguments lined up and you keep your notes organized so that the debate round does not get messy. And that's what we're going to be talking about here. So flowing, at the end of the day, is just about taking organized notes in a debate round. Now, the bad news is that most of the ways that you know how to take notes right now are not going to be super useful for debate itself. The reason is because typically in a classroom, for instance, when you're taking notes, you just kind of write from left to right, all the way horizontally across the page, go on to the next line, so on and so forth. And you just kind of write like that, maybe in an outline form if you're taking good bullet-pointed notes. In a debate round, though, that's not the flow of a debate round. It doesn't go entirely sequentially. Instead, it's about lining up arguments across different speeches. And so that requires you to take notes in a very different way. And so here are the most important principles when it comes to flowing. The first, and this is the biggest difference from how you would normally take notes, is you should write down the arguments for each speech in their own column rather than write horizontally across the page. So you can imagine, let's say there are 4 speeches in a debate, okay? An affirmative speech, then a negative speech, then an affirmative speech, then a negative speech. You would have 4 columns going from left to right in the order of the speeches. So it'd be the first affirmative speech as the first column, the first negative speech as the second column, the second affirmative speech as the third column, and the second negative speech as the fourth column. And don't worry, I'm going to show you an example of what this all looks like in just a moment, but that big conceptual shift is really important when thinking about flowing. You have 1 column per speech, as opposed to just like an affirmative side of the paper. Here's 1 column for all the aff arguments, and another side, 1 column for all the neg arguments. The reason you do not do that is because, again, the key to taking good notes in a debate is making sure that you can track how arguments are developing across a debate round. So if you have 1 set of arguments, let's say we're talking about pizza being the best food, and one of the questions is whether or not pizza is a very cheap option, you need all of the arguments on both sides of the debate that pertain to that question of cost being lined up sequentially so that you can keep track of what's going on that question. Second, as I was just mentioning, you want to make sure to line up those corresponding arguments right next to each other, okay? So you can imagine you would flow down a page, down a column for a particular speech, but then in the next speech, when that opponent begins responding to specific arguments the previous speaker made, you want to make sure to line those arguments up right next to each other. That way, it'll be very easy for you to keep track of what everyone in the debate has said. Third, you want to make sure to leave blank space between each argument. And the reason for this is because arguments develop in a debate round. And so let's say, a speaker says pizza is the best food ever because of its cheap cost in one speech. Well, that's pretty short, right? That's only going to take a little bit of space to write. But let's say in the next speech, the opponent has 3 responses to that. Well, if you didn't leave any space between the cheap cost argument and the next argument that first speaker made, well, then all of a sudden your entire flow is going to get messed up. And I'm going to show you an example of that in just a moment. Fourth, you want to make sure to keep track of citations. So in addition to writing down the arguments, you also want to keep track of when a debater reads actual evidence. And you want to do that by not just marking that evidence was read, but by ideally writing down the last name of the author that was read, as well as the year that it was read. And then what debaters do, again, I know this is all abstract right now, I'm about to show you some examples, is underline the citation to make it easy to see that evidence was read. This is useful to remind yourself, hey, this debater read an entire article or read pieces of evidence here. I should look at those pieces of evidence and do that evidence qualification or that we were talking about in the last lecture, right? Going through and saying, is this credible? Does this make sense? Does it have strong warrants? Is it recent? All of that analysis can be really important, and so keeping track of that in your notes is really, really useful. Fifth and finally, make sure to use shorthand notations, all right? You need abbreviations. If you try to write down every single word that the other speaker says, you will confront an impossible task. Because think about everything that you are being asked to do as a debater. It's actually almost impossible and takes a lot of time to be able to do it really well. But the more you abbreviate, the better off you will be. Because in addition to keeping track of what your opponent is saying, right, during their speech, you'll be jotting down the notes of what they are saying. You will also be thinking about what you are going to say and probably jotting down some notes about your responses to those arguments. And in addition, you might also be needing to pull out evidence to support some of those arguments. Doing all of that simultaneously, really, really difficult, all right? And it can feel overwhelming, but the easiest way to get over that feeling and to make it actually very manageable and to make it very easy to keep the debate organized and to know what you're saying is to have good notes. And that starts with good shorthand notation, all right? So let me show you some examples of what this looks like. Here's some flowing shorthand that I would use, for instance. All right, like for instance, because would just be B/C, causes or leads to would just be an arrow. You would see increase or higher is just an arrow up, decrease is an arrow down, impact would just be an exclamation point, not or does not or false, I would just put a circle with a line through it. With would be W dash, without W dash O, within, similar idea. Takes out or trades off, BT dash O. Solves is an S with a circle, disadvantage is a DA, so on and so forth. So you can look at a couple more of these. The important thing, though, is typically in each debate round, you will develop your own shorthand, okay, based on what's going on within the round. So if we're talking about Saudi Arabia, for instance, you're not going to write out Saudi Arabia every time. That's going to take too much precious time. Instead, just write SA. If you're talking about a universal basic income, just write UBI. You don't need to write the whole thing. So whatever that is for that particular round, you want to make sure to find some shorthand for those specific arguments that are being read or for the content so that you don't have to write complete words. That's the important thing. And I'm about to show you an example of a flow just so you can see what it looks like. And know that I wrote much more than I would actually write if I were debating. I just did that so that you, as the viewer, could understand it a little bit better, kind of how the arguments were tracing. Because if you were to just see truly what one of my flows looked like if I was debating, it would only really make sense to me. It would just look like kind of symbols and short abbreviated letters and like maybe a word here or there. And it would make sense to me because I would understand the shorthand, but it probably wouldn't make sense to other people. One thing I do want to point out, though, is right down here, right? Sometimes it happens to the best of us. In fact, as you are beginning, it will be very hard to actually hear the exact citation of an evidence, all right? So you'll be like, oh my God, they just read an author name, they just read a date, they're now reading evidence. What did they just say, right? What was the last name? I missed it. I didn't even hear the date. Don't fear. What to do there is just, this is the kind of shorthand in the debate community. You do XX and then just an underline. And that just indicates to yourself, okay, evidence was read. I didn't get the citation. I should ask for their evidence and get it after the speech so that I can fill it in later. But at least I know here that evidence was read. So I know I need to look into this a little bit later. So yeah, everything else should be pretty straightforward here. Let's jump in and take a look at what an actual flow would look like. So, okay, we're sticking to the pizza example because I feel like it's straightforward. The affirmative team is arguing pizza is the best food ever. The negative team is arguing it's not the best food. So you can see here, there were 4 speeches in this debate. This wasn't actually a real debate, but I just put together a flow as if there was one. So this first affirmative speaker, right, you can see their speech. It starts here, pizza is the best food, and then the speaker had 3 arguments. So this purple column right here is the entire first speech. Now notice how different this is, right? Normally you would think like, let me write down the notes across the entire page, across the entire page, across the entire page, but that's not how you take notes, because if you do that, you're not going to be able to line up arguments. So imagine, for instance, if you wrote down this speech in the way that you normally take notes for class, you would say pizza is the best food probably on the first line, then you would say 1 here, and it would be like delicious taste, you'd fill that in. 2 here, you would say it's cheap cost, and you'd fill that in, and then 3 down below would be about the huge variety of flavors for everybody. Okay, but now in the next speech, once this negative speaker starts responding to each of these arguments, notice they're not going to be lined up. And all of a sudden, if you try to figure out, okay, wait, what did the first affirmative speaker say about the taste set of arguments? And what did the first negative speaker say? You're going to be jumping all over the page, and it gets complicated. So you can see here, this first speech introduced 3 pretty straightforward arguments. It has delicious taste. It says polls prove this. 87% of Americans agree that pizza tastes delicious, and this was from the New York Times in 2019. Then they read an argument that said it has a cheap cost, and the average cost of a pizza is only $12. This is Johnson in 18. And then the third argument is that there's a huge variety of flavors, which means everyone can enjoy it. So awesome. So pretty straightforward. Note how I put the line here to indicate that evidence was read. I put down the citation, New York Times 19. Down here I put down Johnson in 18, whoever Dr. Johnson is. Now let's go to the negative. Negative says pizza is not the best food ever. And look at this direct refutation here, all right? They line up the arguments, you put the line there so that you can track it, and they say, no, it's bad that it tastes so good because people eat it often, and pizza is unhealthy. And then they read evidence from Professor Prabhu from June 24th of this year that says that pizza is a really, really unhealthy food, and people should not be encouraged to eat it. For the cost argument, they read a piece of evidence from Dr. Mehta that says that there are lots of other cheaper options rather than pizza. So, okay, you're saying this is a direct clash here. And then the third one, they made 2 arguments, right? For the huge variety, they said, well, not really, because A, it excludes lactose intolerant people, and B, it excludes people who are trying to eat healthy. So do you see how it's really useful, actually, to line up these arguments right next to each other? Because now as a debater, or even if you were just watching a debate, trying to understand a debate, now you can actually see how each of the arguments are developing. And oftentimes, actually, not every single argument will make it into the final speeches. Debaters typically actually hang their hat on 1 or 2 of the most important arguments, which is another reason you'll see that some of the flows will get a little bigger as the debate goes on. Like the second argument, you can see there's more and more text here, whereas this third argument kind of peters out, right? By the end, there's not really a ton being said on this third argument. And sometimes debaters will just not even go for an argument at all. The third speech, which is the second affirmative speech, right? You can see here, they try to extend their own argument. They say, the negative conceded that 87% of people like it. That proves that pizza is the best because it's the most liked, and deliciousness is the highest value of how we should evaluate food because that's why we eat food in the first place. So you can see here, they didn't really respond to the healthiness claim, but they just extended their own argument and said, ultimately, this matters more than anything else because deliciousness is why we eat. Second argument, there are lots of cheaper options. Notice they do an evidence comparison. They say their evidence is really outdated. This is from 2004. Prices have changed a lot over the last 16 years or however long. And B, there are lots of other options, right? There's fast food, the other options that are cheaper. The other options that are cheaper are fast food and they're unhealthier, right? So yes, you could go get McDonald's for cheaper than pizza, but McDonald's is more unhealthy than pizza. And third, to these questions about exclusion, they say, no, there's healthy vegan salad pizza options, right? If you've ever been to Mod Pizza, you can get the salad pizza and you can get a vegan version of it. Satisfies everybody. And so notice the arguments are developing, they're transforming throughout the debate, and this way you can line it all up. And finally, in the final speech, you can see here, the negative debater stands up and says, health is ultimately the highest value, not deliciousness, because being healthy keeps you alive. All right, they conceded that pizza is unhealthy. The dairy, meat, and carbs all combine to make it really unhealthy. They extend their Prabhu evidence, right? They say that's our evidence from Professor Prabhu, who indicates that. And so they're going all in on this question of health, okay? And notice they do something pretty creative down here. They say, look, unhealthiness means that the cheap cost is bad because people buy it more frequently. So they're kind of conceding. They're like, all right, fine, pizza is cheap, but ultimately this is bad because people buy it more frequently. And all of the affirmative arguments about accessibility mean that more people are ultimately unhealthy. So pretty tricky move in this final negative speech. They're saying, hey, fine, if pizza is unhealthy, if there's lots of taste, if lots of people like to eat it and it's accessible, that's a reason why it's bad, because it's making people unhealthy. And finally, they say even the healthy options, right, are still full of carbs, which means they're not healthy. So less important than the specific arguments here is just making sure you understand this basic structure of flowing the speeches in columns, lining up the arguments, making sure to leave space. Like notice I left a couple of lines here between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, knowing that, the arguments were going to expand throughout the debate. These are all the core basic skills of what you do in flowing. If it helps at first to flow in different colors, that's great. If you would prefer to just flow in one color, that's fine as well. But I recommend certainly writing this down. I think having a place to jot notes, to be able to do that shorthand easily, to draw arrows and connect things easily, it can just be a lot harder to do that on computer. And especially when you're first starting, I think it's really, really useful to do this on paper. And second, just making sure that you understand the basic components of flowing. These are all really important. Ultimately, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, ask me. I'd be more than happy to help through any confusions. But hopefully, this made some sense and you have a better understanding of how to take organized notes during a debate round.